understand. I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California and member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. Starting another week, moving on down the path to empowering you to be your very own real estate rebel. Welcome to it. Hope y'all had a great weekend. As I've sort of started doing here a couple of weeks back, we're going to go ahead and hit a few interesting news bits that have sort of crossed the desktop since the last time we spoke. There's a lot of very interesting things. One thing we talked about last week was the potential effect on the downturn in the energy sector on banks in general. Remember, lots of money has been lent to energy producers. In the United States, there was a lot of speculation in terms of smaller energy companies really going out there and because the price made sense. Remember when a barrel of oil was much higher, the return on investment made sense, right? To go to a lot of trouble to use more expensive methods to extract the oil. So and this was happening in North Dakota and all over the country. A lot of different places were seeing sort of a boom in the energy sector. And so a lot of those folks were taking out loans from banks to achieve this. One interesting thing that's now come about because of the downturn in the cost of a barrel of oil, so much of this debt is out there. Energy creditors are going to be lucky to recover 15 cents on the dollar as many of these small energy companies go under. Last Wednesday, Zero Hedge reported that in the latest twist of the energy sector collapse, liquidating oil and gas producers, and specifically their creditors, got a nasty lesson in trough cycle asset values when in one after another bankruptcy stalking horse, aka 363 auction, they were not only unable to cover the outstanding debt, both secured and unsecured, through asset sales, but barely able to cover a tiny fraction of it. Several points here. Dune went belly up, owing $144.2 million. Its assets sold for $20 million. In May, these are energy companies. In May, American Eagle Corporation filed for bankruptcy with debts of $215 million. Its property sold for $45 million in October. BPZ Resources Incorporated owed $275.2 million. Its assets fetched about $9 million. Endeavor International Corporation went into bankruptcy owing $1.63 billion with a B. The company sold some assets for $9.6 million and handed over the rest to lenders. ERG Resources LLC opened an auction with a minimum bid of $250 million. Response: no takers, no bidders at all. So it's absolutely a situation where the banks are going to take the hit on a lot of these. According to what I'm reading, this isn't likely a situation where these banks will necessarily go out of business based on these, but it's absolutely going to have a negative effect on some of these larger banks that have been funding these loans. Another headline that came across, the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was sort of sold to the American public as something that would actually create jobs, is now likely to cost, according to a new study, 448,000 American jobs. So it's not going to create 448,000 jobs. It's going to cost us 448,000 jobs. One of the major purported selling points, I'm quoting now from the article, Let's see. One of the major purported selling points for the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a supposed increase in new jobs as a result of the controversial trade deal. The deal involves 12 nations, including the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, Malaysia, and more. However, two recent economic reports have contradicted the claims that jobs will increase. They have shown that more than likely the deal will lead to a loss of jobs. So that's two different studies that have been done that have pointed to that. According to the World Bank's figures, the U.S. will gain an extra 0.04 GDP per year on average as a result of TPP, Australia an extra 0.07 annually, and Canada's a boost of 0.12 per year. Let's see. In a study titled Trading Down Unemployment, Inequality, and Other Risks of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, this study uses a more realistic model than past analysis. Specifically, the researchers state that their model incorporates effects on employment that were previously excluded from TPP calculations. Quote, their study found that economic growth is likely to be limited and negative for some countries, including the United States. Changes in GDP growth are mostly projected to be negligible. TPP would lead to employment losses in all countries, with a total of 771,000 lost jobs. The United States would be the hardest hit with a loss of 448,000. So I'll include a link to this. And employment always figures prominently, and particularly what expectations are going to be for employment in my assessments of future markets for real estate. The core of a successful real estate market is a successful employment market. Now, having said all of that, the TPP is not a done deal yet. It's been talked about for a while. You've probably heard about it in the press if you listen to any of those kinds of things, or at least maybe seen it in passing. In addition to the now projected loss of 448,000 jobs in the U.S., and I'd love to find out what kind of jobs those are. I'd like to know if those are supposed to be more career-oriented jobs, more entry-level jobs. But none of that data seems available. But the net conclusion here is that it's a loss in jobs, which is, no matter how you slice it, a bad thing, no matter what level those jobs are coming from. The latest analysis of TPP job claims is even more dismal than a February 2015 analysis by the Washington Post, which, in the long and the short of it, broke down quotes from Secretary of State John Kerry and Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, and even with that not so deep a level of scrutiny, they indicated that the result would be a net number of 0 new jobs for the United States. The TPP has faced criticism for several years, not least because it has been negotiated in secret with overwhelming influence from multinational corporations. The earliest that this could be signed is February 4th of 2016. According to these reports, it'll give corporations loopholes to escape accountability and empower international bodies, overriding the national sovereignty of the signing countries. In late 2015, Anti-Media reported the TPP might not be voted on until after the 2016 presidential elections, or possibly in the next presidential term. Let's see here. Everything in the TPP that increases corporate rights and interests is binding, whereas every provision that is meant to protect the public interest is not binding and is susceptible to get bulldozed by efforts to protect corporations. So I think this is something we could dodge, assuming that folks take a more critical analysis of it. I'd strongly suggest that for those of you who want to express your opinion one way or the other, look into it a little bit more. There'll be links in the show notes to take you to the article that I've got this from, which then also has links to the Washington Post and other places and where the research came from. So it's an opportunity for you to take a look at that. And I bring it up because I think it's a very big deal. And I think a lot of these things that are going on in terms of international agreements relating to how labor is handled and how trade is handled, oftentimes seem to want to drag a lot of countries down to a lowest common denominator instead of allowing each individual country to excel without a lot of regulatory interventions that force lower standards that are nuts. So, and you can take a look at that and see how you feel about it for yourself. Another article that came across was Just kind of an interesting side note how billionaires are investing in 2016. And it's something we've talked about. In fact, even use the exact same phrase, but in a slightly different context. They're saying the only winning move is not to play the game, and I was using that quote in the context of not letting yourself just get sucked right into going for that maximum bid that you can do on a home, and really fighting that trend and trying to find a different, maybe more out of the box way to achieve your goals. But I found this interesting. Because a lot of these investors now, what that translates to for these investors is keep your money in cash and don't invest it. And that's bad in general. Money that billionaires invest in different things, you have to think about where that money goes. That goes into starting new companies, into folks getting loans, whether it's for business or home or whatever. It just puts more money out into the system. When a lot of folks keep their money in the bank or shoved in their mattress or wherever they want it to be, and in the bank is even less and less likely, because if you this article again is linked in the show notes if you want to check it out. But right now, quote, the trade now is to hold as much cash as possible. That's from the chief investment officer for Generali, a European insurer with 480 billion in assets. Equity markets could go down 15% to 20%. And let's put this into context, right? That folks in Europe are totally going to get. If you think back to what happened in Greece, even money in your bank wasn't safe. They locked assets at a certain point in Greece and prevented you from being able to access them. And then when folks had assets at a certain level, they actually seized portions of that. So the Europeans get it a little bit better than we do because they saw it happen so close, particularly because of Greece's participation in the European Union. I think a lot of folks in the United States don't quite grok that, but I think slowly but surely more and more people are going to want to hold actual cash in their hot little hands, and that's that kind of works counter to how the system functions. In other words, when all the cash is being held outside of banks and outside of institutions and in the hands of the individual, the money still gets spent on an as-needed basis, but it's not fluid. It's not flowing around out there within the system. And it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. But I don't know how many of you have ever had conversations with your great-grandparents or have heard stories shared with you by folks who talk to your great-grandparents about how in the Great Depression, everyone was shoving money and no one trusted banks, and they were shoving their money into mattresses and hiding it in the walls of their home and all these other kinds of things. It's bizarre as all get out to now see that. And everyone mocked these folks, right? Everyone thought these folks were nuts who did this. And now we start to see the exact same things cropping up that pushed those folks to that point back then. And suddenly they don't sound quite so dumb, or at least quite so irrational as I think a lot of folks thought they were in the years after the Great Depression. All right, so let's jump in. Really the topic for today are things your agent should really never say to you. And I thought it would be good to talk about those things and see what other thoughts we might be able to add, just so that we're always as protected as possible when it comes to our expectations for our real estate agents. This comes to us from Forbes magazine, so it's a pretty well-respected source. So these are all the things you should never hear your agent say. Number one, you don't need a home inspection. I completely agree with this one. In fact, there are reasons for both the buyer and the seller to get a home inspection. Now, one reason why I would strongly suggest the seller gets a home inspection before you list the house. So in other words, you're sitting down with your agent or with several agents trying to decide which one you're going to work with. One of the things in your little plan should be, before the home gets put on the multiple listing service, before you pick the price that you're going to sell the home for, you should get a home inspection done. Maybe even a termite report depending on the property. If it's a single family residential home, I always suggest at least getting a home inspection. And depending on when the last termite inspection was, if you've had one, say, within the last 3 to 5 years, or if you've had regular termite service since you bought the home, that kind of thing, it may change the decision. But why would you do that? Why would a seller want to spend the $500, $600, $700, $800 total it may cost, depending on the size of your home and how many inspections you get done? Why would you want to do that? Well, it's a very simple answer, and that is you know exactly the condition of the property when you put it up for sale. If you get a termite inspection and you discover there's $15,000 worth of work that needs to be done, well, you need to take that into account in your pricing strategy. Same goes for the home inspection, and usually the home inspection that I get done, I use a company that will oftentimes give me little clues to point me in the direction of whether or not a termite inspection might also reveal some very serious stuff. But I find that a home inspection will usually reveal some of the more expensive items that might be there. So wouldn't you rather have that information as a seller beforehand? And oftentimes what you'll find is that buyers will simply accept your home inspection and your termite inspection. And so it's all known. There's no more surprises. As soon as you sign that contract, you can pretty much write down a number and know that that's what you're going to get at close of escrow. Now, you as the buyer, of course you want a home inspection. It's absolutely stupid to not get one. In fact, anyone who tells you not to is not keeping your best interests in mind. You want to know what the problems are. You want to know what you're buying. If there's leaks, if there's electrical problems, if there's unsafe electrical installation. If you had, and this is a great example, I had a client who wanted to buy a home, and once we got in there and started poking around, we discovered that either the current owner or the previous owner, or someone along the ownership chain, had done a ton of do-it-yourself work on the property and found horrible violations of electrical code to the point where stuff was dangerous. And it required a great deal of rewiring, a lot of work to bring it back up to code. Now, if we hadn't done an inspection, the first clue that you might have gotten that there was a problem with the electrical system could have been your house burning down. And heaven forbid that happen while you and your family are in it. So I strongly demand that my clients get a home inspection. I make it clear that that's not an option. It's something you absolutely must do. Now, what's interesting is, in direct contradiction of that, is I'm going to be having a listing coming up here soon on a townhome that has an HOA, and I'm not going to suggest that my folks get a termite or a home inspection prior to listing it, primarily because I represented them when they bought it, so I know how long ago it happened. I know what reports were done then. I know what they've done, and I know what the homeowners association manages in terms of what it's responsible for, and I know how they've taken care of the place. So I believe it's more optional under those particular circumstances, given my knowledge of the property and the people who've occupied it. And it also becomes less of something you need to worry about when it's not a single-family residential home. If it's a condo or a townhome, it's less necessary simply because the circumstances that can negatively affect a single-family residential home to a great financial degree just aren't really there in condos and townhomes a great deal of the time, unless you can see that a lot of perhaps home DIY stuff has been done inside of the unit, and then a home inspection might be something that you want to do as the seller, just so you're prepared for those possibilities when a buyer does one. Now, as a buyer, there is no property purchase where you don't get a home inspection in my book. If you're a buyer, you always get one. If there's a problem, you want to know about it ahead of time. Even if these things are minor, you may find yourself in a position where you can ask for concessions from the seller and get those things taken care of. So it's always good to get it done if you're a buyer. I would never be in a buying situation and not get one. Number two, this is, again, things your agent should never say to you. I read the contract for you, just sign on the line. And what's creepy is I've actually heard agents who have said this to clients in the past. That is absolutely not your agent's role. Their role is to read it and perhaps call out things of concern. However, I also want to suggest that for you as a buyer or a seller, either side of the transaction, before you even list the house, ask your agent for a blank copy or just a dummy copy of what the standard contract is in your area. Now, we have two here in Silicon Valley for some stupid reason. We have the California Association of Realtors and we have the PRDS documents. CAR is far more common, but because a lot of the Silicon Valley folks need to feel special, they will often use the PRDS form. And there's a lot of subtle reasons why one tends to emphasize protections more for a seller and one seems to emphasize protections a little bit more for the buyer, which is a lot of times an argument that folks will use as to why they use one over the other. That's maybe a whole other show. But I will usually give my buyers and sellers a blank of that ahead of time so that they can see everything that's in there. The real difference comes down to how the blank parts get filled out. There's a lot of boilerplate in there that doesn't change. The things relating to how you negotiate disputes and those types of things can be important. But the real nitty-gritty of what's going to happen on a deal-to-deal basis is going to be how the blanks get filled in. So there's no downside to making buyers and sellers aware ahead of time of what all that other stuff is. For much of the California Association of Realtors contract, there are entire pages where nothing gets filled out. It's strictly just going to stay the way it is in every instance that you see it or that you are exposed to it. So it makes great sense for you to have a copy of that right up front. I've never understood why most agents save their client's first exposure to the contract for when one's fully filled out. So I always like to make sure my folks have a copy. If you're a buyer or a seller and you're about to get involved with real estate through a real estate agent, ask them for a blank of that contract. It's going to be a lot easier for you to more casually read it as you have time because nothing is less exciting than the real estate contract. Check that out. If you have any questions, highlight them. My job is to add clarity where there isn't any, and then to perhaps even educate you on what types of numbers to expect to be or comments to be entered in the various blanks. You know, what my as a seller, what could I expect from these? In terms of what gets filled out. So just be proactive. If your agent doesn't offer it ahead of time, and most don't, just ask for it. But if you do find yourself in a position where the first time you see it is when either you're filling it out or you're receiving an offer from a buyer and your agent's presenting it to you, absolutely feel free to answer all those questions. And if your agent is a fully online digital agent like I tend to be, where the comfort and the ease of being able to do things online and sign digitally is a great tool to be able to act quickly, don't let that stop you from using any one of the tons of tools available to interactively go over that contract with your agent. You can use Google Hangouts, you can use GoToMeeting, or there's a variety of different services that you guys can use where you can both be looking at the exact same thing, talking to each other verbally so you can hear everybody, and even have a pen that you can use to doodle on these things that you're looking at so that there's absolute clarity on what everyone's dealing with. There's just no excuse with today's technology to not expect absolute clarity in what you're working on with your agents. Next, number 3, that smell will go away. And this is a big one. Particularly when I have clients, when I'm representing buyers that have allergies or asthma, this is something they'll usually bring up first. Smells, unless you take remediative action, most smells are not going to go away. And it really depends on the level of the smell and how long it's been going on. Some smells absolutely can be dealt with. Pet smells in particular can tend to be dealt with because those tend to be in the carpet pad, those types of things. And as long as you rip all that stuff out, that smell is most likely going to go away. And I always suggest that folks follow up that with a complete cleaning of all the duct work inside of a house, just to make sure all that pet hair and other types of miscellaneous junk is not still getting blown around inside your house. Smoking is a little bit different. It can permeate all kinds of different things. It can get sucked into walls. So sometimes that can be a little bit more difficult, but usually if you replace any fabric type stuff, wallpaper that has a fabric-y feel to it, as long as you've got strategies for dealing with these smells, here's a great thing about smells. It's one of the number one turnoffs right? And agents always play the smell game. That's why when you go to open houses, they often have candles burning with different scents, or they bake cookies, so that those smells are around in the house. And I'll tell you what, my ground experience in showing houses, if it smells like fresh paint and new carpet, you're increasing by a pretty good chunk the odds that that house is going to sell. If you walk into a house with a crappy smell, if you're someone who already ahead of time knows how to remediate that stuff, you're in a better position. I've had clients walk into a house, smell cigarette smoke, and turn around and walk out. They're not interested in moving a step further. They don't want to see any more of the house. They want to get out. When I take a listing on a house like that, my number one concern is to try and remediate that smell before the house gets listed. And if I do have actively smoking clients who live in the house as sellers, the new rule has to be nobody smokes inside the house, because remember, we don't sell a house the same way we live in a house, which is sometimes tough for folks to get, but it's absolutely true. So the point I'm making here with the smells is, as long as you know what to do to deal with it, it can absolutely put you in a great position as a buyer, because of how dramatically smells turn people off. If you know you can deal with it and you can come up with a price, you can make an offer on that property and you can be more aggressive. You can bring that price down, and not only bring it down because you want to, because of the smell, but you can also do that to cover the cost of remediation, plus put a little bit more in your pocket for the trouble of having to do it. But as long as you understand the steps needed to get rid of those smells, I think stinky houses are some of the best deals around, simply because it's a lot easier to remediate that than, homes that have whatever other kind of damage or issues that might have to be dealt with, that can cost an awful lot of money. Typically, smell remediation is something that's a lot easier to do. Number 4, quote, "The house has city water, so you're safe." If this is a concern for you, you absolutely need to get the water tested. Now, as a standard process, I do not do water testings. Now, what they say here is, real estate agents often see a treatment system and think the water has been taken care of. Do not assume this. Have your water tested on any sale, city water, or well. This is something you cannot change once you move into the home. Some houses have high chlorination byproducts, elevated chlorine levels, arsenic, lead, radiological, and chemicals in the water. Never assume the water is okay just because your real estate agent tells you it's city water. Testing isn't cheap. A water test will run you about $300, but it's much better than finding out the hard way that your water isn't safe. So this is an interesting one. I have never had a client feel the need to get water tested. I have had a water test done myself. We actually had a bizarre situation here in Morgan Hill where there were high levels or higher than you should have of a thing called a perchlorate in your water. Perchlorates only come from 2 things: rocket fuel and road flares, and they're bad, and there's no way to get rid of it once it's in the water. And there was a company here that used to make road flares that argued that they were not the source of the perchlorates. And so that court case went on for a very long time, and there was remediation attempted. But one thing that you don't think of when you're visiting a home, I mean, you might flush the toilets, you might turn on the light switches, but do you sample the water? Do you take a little drink of the water from the faucet and see if it's something that is okay for you? Make that part of your standard process. And if you're concerned at all, ask for one of these reports. But again, it's not cheap. It's an expensive test. And if you can get information from the city water authority or wherever the source of the water is, if you can get information from them on the quality of the water, these guys usually are testing the water on a regular basis to see if there's issues with it. And usually either through a website or through direct contact, you can find out if there's any issues with the water, if it's something you're particularly sensitive to. Me, personally, the way I get around that is I subscribe to a water service that brings me jugs. So the only thing I ever do with the water that comes in the pipes into my house is bathe and do dishes and that type of stuff. So I'm a little bit more anal retentive when it comes to that stuff. So I'm not sure everyone wants to jump through those hoops, but I know plenty of people, for instance, in Morgan Hill, that drink the water and just push right through. All right. Number 6, I don't do email. Sure, there may be one of the kindest agents in town, but if they resist the use of technology when it comes to me communicating with you and sending documents, you should be concerned. I actually tend to agree with this. I actually know some good agents who maybe aren't quite as tech savvy, but if they can't even reach the low shelf of email, there's a whole lot of problems there. But let's cover why for a second, because it's not just a question of fast communication. Now, in my business, I have a completely digital setup, so we can do the entire process without technically having to meet. And that is a great power, particularly in a market where sometimes you need to move ridiculously fast in order to submit an offer. Right now, markets are crazy. Buyers are outnumbering the houses by an awful lot. Houses are tending to get multiple offers. And if the person who's listed the house has given a short period of time between it being listed and the time that offers are expected, or if for some reason your buyer has discovered the property late in the listing, let's say it's originally only going to be on the market for a week before offers are accepted, and they discovered after 5 days, you need to be able to work quickly. And the great thing with a digital setup is I can have an offer usually written up in 15 minutes. I click a button, it shows up in each one of my clients' email boxes. They click a link, they go, they view it, they click the various places to sign. So literally within 20 to 30 minutes, I can have a signed offer ready to go. And then the only other things that need to happen is the pre-approval letter, any addendums that we might need to add, and I also usually will write a cover letter assuming I'm not going to be able to present it in person, which in today's market is almost always. Not only am I not able to because of time constraints, but it's been a long time. I'll ask every time, are we going to be given an opportunity to present our offers in person? I much prefer doing that, by the way. It's one of the old school things that actually I think still pays off huge, but it's probably been 2.5 years since I had an agent say I could present an offer in person. Nobody wants to do it. And what's interesting is it's not agents saying don't do it. It's sellers who just don't want to be bothered with seeing someone in front of them. They want to try to judge these offers simply by what's on paper. And while I get the motivation for that, I like the give and take in a sit down discussion. And if they won't say, yeah, we'll sign it right now, I'll say, well, what changes would you want to make this something that you could sign right now? So that gives me an idea of where we can move with the negotiation. So that's the only part of it that's still old school for me. And also when you're finding yourself in tight time constraints, there's nothing better than being able to be completely digital and online with all of your documents. Number 7, I've set up 20 homes for you to look at today, and we're on a tight schedule. We can spend only 10 minutes at each home. Yeah, that's nuts. And that number will change from person to person. My ex-wife, for instance, she would be bleeding out of her eyes long before we ever hit 20 homes in a single day. You never want to do that. Unfortunately, the expectations on the part of sellers is, in a lot of cases, is you make an appointment and you need to give them a 30-minute window of when you'll arrive. And boy, is that tough when you start showing homes in the morning and you start getting into the afternoon, and you may have taken more time or less time, and then you find yourself sort of missing those windows later in the day. In my opinion, you need the time to really consider each property. 20 homes in a day is nuts, but you know what? It's really going to depend on your clients. If or you as a buyer, if you're someone who can really rip through that stuff, maybe 20 isn't unreasonable. I think 20 is absolutely nuts. Half that is even approaching nuts. But the bottom line is it comes down to what you can do before that frustration level kicks in. There comes a point where you just want to move on to the next one, and you might end up discounting a home far more than you would if you hadn't already just looked at 6 homes. So keep that in mind. I get the intensity that can happen in some marketplaces where you feel like you really have to get through these places. But let me suggest you keep each outing of home viewing at a reasonable level so that you can have an intelligent recollection of all the homes that you viewed in a day and really be able to call out the standout homes that you liked. It's going to be really hard to do that if you've looked at 10 homes that day or more. A lot easier if it's 5 to 7 tops that you've looked at in that day. Let's see. That's about it. That's again from Forbes. We'll have a link to that article. I think we've covered it pretty in depth here, so hopefully some good tips for those of you out there who are going to be keeping an eye on what the agent you select says to you during the process of making your purchase. And I hope that that's been valuable information for you. Thanks again for listening, everybody. If you'd like to get in contact with me, feel free to head on over to www.therebelbroker.com. As I mentioned, the show notes will have links to all the different articles that were in today's show. And if you'd like to get in contact with me about ideas, suggestions, observations, that is absolutely the place to do it. And of course, as always, please take a couple of minutes out of your day and review or give a thumbs up or a smiley face or whatever, however you consume the show, whatever tools they have to give some feedback. Please take a moment to do that. It's the best way for you to help the show grow, and I absolutely appreciate it when folks go out of their way to do that kind of thing. So thanks again for listening, everybody, and I will talk to you all next time.